to Institute Encounters. Today we have the great privilege and pleasure of a distinguished guest from Stanford. We like to bring in distinguished guests from Stanford. Walter Scheidel. Walter Scheidel is the Dickerson Professor of Humanities at Stanford, the author of a variety of very interesting studies in comparative history. Most recently, the one he's working on now, The Great Leveler, a comparative history of inequality. That would be close enough. It's a working title. Okay. And has done some very interesting work on comparative ancient history, which is what I'd sort of like to begin our discussion talking about. One would think, living in an age that is always advertised as global, and in which we have around the country multiplying courses in world history which profess to be global, that there would be a lot of comparative historical study actually going on. But I gather that the menu that consists of all these courses is not necessarily, at this stage of the game, a very accurate description of what goes on in the kitchen. Is that the case? I mean, is there a lot of interesting comparative history out there, or is it something that we need to do more of?
It's certainly something we need to do more of. There is not a whole lot out there. I think there are multiple reasons. The most important one would be specialization, that people do not feel comfortable branching out beyond their area of, well, what they are paid to do. There is not enough collaboration, which would be an obvious solution to this problem. And as a result, there isn't a whole lot of teaching either. You have courses on world history, but they are usually just surveys of, well, global history, the most important developments that unfold over time. But they are rarely explicitly comparative. In fact, I once did a study, a little survey of textbooks on world history, and I found that very few of them explicitly engage in any kind of comparison. There are one or two that I've found, but it's rare even in those texts. It's not really surprising that there isn't a whole lot going on.
So what you have, I guess, is parallel histories.
You have parallel history, exactly, yes.
Ordered chronologically.
Chronologically and geographically, and then you have to struggle to make it parallel because of a different pace of development in different parts of the globe, which in a way doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If you treat the old world, the new world, Australia, Africa, in a synchronous fashion, you are describing very different phenomena that just happen to take place in the same century or the same part of a particular millennium, but it doesn't really add up to any kind of, story of macrosocial evolution. So in order to do that, you would probably have to adjust the chronology to produce parallel history that's really worth doing, or even better, put more emphasis on comparison, which, as I said, is still remarkably rare.
Now, I guess there are kind of two big obstacles to overcome in trying to create a genuine comparative history of civilizations. One is the fact that it's really difficult for people to master language and other things needed to really know let alone a whole set of civilizations in depth. But the other, I would think, is conceptual, is trying to kind of organize a system for asking questions that reflects things that are both universal, but at the same time capable of being able to uncover divergencies and variations, et cetera, et cetera. What is this? What is the status, to the extent it can be described, of the conceptual underpinnings for comparative civilization studies?
That is a very good question, because when you do encounter comparative history, it's often simply, again, a form of parallel narrative. Certain things happened in place A, similar things happened in place B, or different things. And it doesn't really amount to a kind of more social scientific analysis. It's not really driven primarily by questions. And I agree entirely. You would have to identify meaningful questions first and then design your study in a way to address those. And that's simply not very common, I think, in history today. And again, there are multiple reasons for this. There is a general distrust of the notion of causation, because ultimately these questions would have to do with why, not just describing similarities or differences, but trying to figure out why things turned out a certain way in a particular part of the world. And, well, in the wake of deconstruction and the focus on meaning and all those things, that's something that's not very strongly pursued anymore by many historians, because they would shy away from making any kind of bold statement about, well, causal factors. It's something you would find much more in the social sciences, and that's why you get more systematic comparative studies and research designs that are really more suitable for pursuing those kinds of questions. So I think there's a methodological divide by now between the social science approach to comparison and what historians are likely to do.
Well, if historians are now wary of causality, what is it that they are left to do?
Well, they can study what things meant to people at the time. That's what I'm usually told when I ask this question, which I'm sure it's a worthy endeavor, but it's not something I would call.
You mean the specious notions of causality they had in the past? Is that what's... Because there's not much in meaning. There isn't much in one's social understanding, even if you're a contemporary looking around the world, not as a professional, but simply as an ordinary person. You're not going to have much meaning in the things that you see unless you have some notion of causality. What comes from what?
You would think so.
You would think so. So what do this? I'm always happy as a social scientist to hear from a historian that we social scientists have something to offer. And what are the more interesting kind of conceptual tools that the social sciences kind of present to someone who'd want to do comparative history?
Ideally, you would want to be able to engage in formal testing of propositions and hypotheses, which one way or another leads to some form of multivariate regression analysis, which is, again, something historians would not be comfortable with, or the data may not be suitable for this kind of project. It depends very much on what you're looking at. It doesn't have to go that far. What is striking is that there is not a single introduction for historians on how to do comparative history, which is really quite remarkable. There are now introductions to what is world history, what is this, what is that. There is, as far as I know, at least in English, there is no one book that tries to address this, whereas if you look at sociology or political science, there are introductions to that. So it's actually kind of difficult to answer this question because people don't think about it systematically. I don't even make an attempt to identify the most promising concepts or research designs. So we are very much at the beginning in that respect.
Well, what about yourself? So you undertake comparative history on a fairly broad scale, looking at, say, societies as far removed from each other as China and the Mediterranean. What kind of conceptual luggage do you carry to this task?
Not as much as I would like, because once again it's easier said than done. And when you actually sit down and try to engage with the problems, you do often end up with some kind of analytical narrative. I think that's the best way of phrasing it, where you try to be serious about identifying variables and be clear about what you're looking at. But at the end of the day, it is in fact rather difficult to emulate the social sciences without having access to the same toolkit and the same way of preparing data, coding data, that sort of thing, which is, in practice, is very difficult to do. The other difficulty, of course, is that social scientists would rely more on collaboration, which again is not as common in history, which again has reasons to do with academic sociology, how people are trained, how they begin their careers, what is rewarded, what isn't. And that, I think, is actually, that's the second big problem. The first problem is conceptualization, and the other is lack of collaborative research.
So there are kind of schools of thought, nonetheless, in the comparative study of civilization. For example, there's world systems theory. There's, well, I don't know if there's any other kind of body of thought that can be given a neat label of that kind. But what do you think of Immanuel Wallerstein and his students?
I like Immanuel Wallerstein. I met him recently. In fact, he's still active. I think it's a very promising system. Even approach, even though that's also something that doesn't...
Maybe you could explain
Oh,
the
right.
basics of it.
Well, the classic Wallersteinian model would be to say that over the last, how many centuries, 500 years or so, the whole world came to be structured into a core area and peripheral areas, with Western Europe at the top of the pecking order, reshaping the world in a way, establishing and then reshaping relations between different parts of the world in an ultimately exploitative way that drove economic development in Europe, North America eventually, to not always the benefit of other parts of the globe. And that has been expanded away just from looking at the last 500 years, trying to identify earlier world systems that were not global in reach, but that would cover parts of the old world. For instance, going back all the way to Mesopotamia thousands of years ago, or Mexico, or Peru, trying to see if similar relationships, similar patterns can be observed in these earlier cultures. And work has been done on that, especially by experts on the ancient Near East. And once again, it's striking that this kind of work isn't ordinarily done by historians. It's done by people...
What is Wallerstein by training?
I think he's either a sociologist or he's a social scientist. I'm actually not quite sure. I should know this. I think he may be a sociologist originally. But this kind of work on earlier societies that apply world systems theory, that's usually done by people in anthropology departments who have a strong... archaeologists, it's something that was, at least for a while, quite popular in archaeology. Generally, there are just many more theories or bodies of conceptualization in archaeology, certainly in anthropology, again compared to history. It would be hard-pressed to find historians who do world systems theory in any recognizable way.
That's surprising, isn't it? Because
Nothing surprises me.
You're interested in human biology. Is that a fruitful avenue to exploring these questions?
That would most definitely be a fruitful avenue. If you look at human behavioral propensities, of course, you can draw on evolutionary psychology, what used to be known as sociobiology, but now has branched out and become more rigorous in a way, more scientific than maybe it was in first generation work that has attracted a lot of criticism, not all of it unjustified. That would certainly be an avenue to pursue. As I told you earlier, I teach human biology at Stanford, which is a very unusual thing for a historian to do, and it's been educational for me. It's a course on evolution, where my colleagues, it's team-taught, my colleagues cover biological evolution, talking about humans, talking about animal populations, and I talk about social evolution. In order to bring this all together, there's a strong incentive of really thinking about how to structure this in order to make sense of history in the long run within an evolutionary framework. And once you start thinking about this, you see the relevance of evolution, just basic fundamental Darwinian evolutionary theory, in thinking about history, in structuring the narrative.
What historical patterns and relationships are most amenable to this kind of evolutionary analysis?
Well, if you look at the macro level, so what I do is I have very little time to cover tens of thousands of years of macro-social evolution. Of course, the big question is, how do you establish what is now known as ultra-sociality? How do you bring groups of people, how do you create groups of people that go well beyond kin groups in size and eventually morph into modern states with millions of people in them? That's the one big problem, in a way, of human social evolution in the long term, and that's something to be explored through an evolutionary.
And what are some of the tentative hypotheses?
The tentative hypothesis is that if biological evolution is driven by random mutations and selection pressures that are really come out of the environment and interaction with other species, that the development of the scaling up of human group size should be driven by similar phenomenon. There should be random mutations, new ideas, cultural norms, ways of doing things that people come up with and experiment with. And then there are selection pressures out there to determine how successful those cultural mutations are going to be. And if they are successful in a given environment, then that will shape the development of those groups. That helps explain why we end up with the kind of pre-modern states we observe in 99% of recorded history. States that are not very nice, that are predatory, that are run by military elites that foster inequality, and there are very few exceptions to this. And part of the explanation has to be that in a particular kind of environment, at a particular stage of technological development, human capital development, that's simply the most competitive way of organizing large numbers of people. And then you have to think about, well, if this was the most competitive way in a given environment, what has changed in order to produce the more modern developed states that we are now familiar with? Is it environmental change? Is it driven by technology? And these are very, very big questions of history, and I think evolutionary theory can make a real contribution to how we think about this.
What does evolutionary theory tell us about intellectual change and the autonomy of intellectual life as a kind of independent variable affecting these things?
That's probably more difficult to address. People have, of course, tried to apply formal evolutionary theory to the development of culture, as in the idea of memes, right? That people come up with bits and pieces of knowledge or thought or culture that are, again, engaged in competition with other things that fill people's heads. So in a sense, that template works similarly well. Again, there are not all that many people out there, in anthropology in particular, who pursue this, who pursue it at the level of human groups, as in cultural group selection. It's something that has really only gained traction in recent years, or the last decade or so, but it's still very much a minority position. Even within the field, and again, not something that historians would explicitly engage with or necessarily even be aware of.
Which you think is a loss to history?
Anything that can help us and we don't know about or shy away from because it's not familiar is a loss to the profession, of course.
Now, the work that you have done, the work that came to my attention first that you have done, was work that looked at comparative labor systems in the ancient world. And you found something rather interesting. I don't know if you expected to find it or whether it was a surprise, but in the work that you did there, what was the biggest single revelation that, or at least tentative revelations? It's all these things are kind of hard to come by and always a bit uncertain. What was that?
Well, if you reference this particular project, the revelation, if you can call it a revelation, which it wasn't really, but the biggest finding was that there is really such a thing as the West, in the sense of Europe, Western Europe, or even before that the Greco-Roman Mediterranean, being significantly different, not just from surrounding societies, but from every other recorded society on the planet that we have evidence for.
And how far back does this go?
It depends. I looked at how states build things, how big construction projects are undertaken, how the labor is managed, organized, where the workers come from. And the basic finding was really that pre-modern states, going back to the Sumerians 5,000 years ago, going back to Old Kingdom Egypt 5,000 years ago, the governments relied very much on forms of dependent labor, forced labor, where people would, when there wasn't all that much agricultural work to do, would be corralled to work on these big projects and then would go back to their farms. There was convict labor, very popular in China, in other societies as well. Whereas in the West, if I can use this term in this particular case, going back as far as we have evidence for classical Greece, at least 2,500 years, you find that labor markets played a much bigger role, and that it was more common for people to enter into some form of contractual agreement with employers, including the state as an employer, and weren't just told to do things, weren't just coerced into doing them, but there had to be some kind of market transaction that involved compensation, payment, and so on. And that's something that really persists, as far as we can tell, in Europe, in the Western, Central Mediterranean, has persisted pretty much ever since.
Europe here, meaning at the outset, Greece and Rome?
Yes, yeah, that's correct.
What about, do we know much about the Etruscans and folks like that?
We don't know anything about the Etruscans as far as
no?
we know. Everybody built stuff, but all that, we don't even know. Which is, I didn't see. I started studying Roman history a very long time ago, and I didn't really know that we don't know who built Roman roads. which is remarkable because there are lots of Roman roads still today, and they built hundreds of thousands of miles of them, and they're very well built. And they're very well archaeologically attested, and people go and they publish the milestones that the Romans left behind. And if you actually sit down and try to find out who did the work and how was it organized, were people, was it slaves, was it wage laborers, was it, I don't know, convicts? We just simply don't know. They appear in the record, everybody takes it for granted, but if you actually try to figure this out, it's very difficult to do. So we are lucky to have at least some evidence for other state projects that point towards wage labor. So there are huge gaps in our knowledge.
So you think that, you know, despite the fragmentary nature of the evidence, one can have some confidence that this generalization is correct?
In as much as there is evidence, yes. It may, of course, be that all the things we don't know about were organized differently, but it's not very likely. It's possible, but it's not very plausible. So the overall impression that we gain from the evidence we have is that some sort of wage labor is really quite significant.
So here we have an early case of what could be called Western exceptionality. But there are other things. I mean, you wouldn't, for example, find many cases, some, but not many cases outside the West, of Republican government, even at this early stage or later on, for that matter. Do you think these things fit together in any way, or are you willing to conjecture on
I am willing or compelled to conjecture in this particular case. If you have a system, and we actually see earlier forms of a more traditional way of doing things, even in Europe. If you go back to Bronze Age Greece, if you look at the palace cultures in Crete, and especially on the mainland Mycenaean culture, we have written records, we have accounts and lists from these palace archives, and again, there are huge gaps in our knowledge, but they point to a way of doing things that is much more similar to what you find in the ancient Near East. So there seems to be some break with not just the past, but a break with almost a global pattern early on, which coincides, maybe not coincidentally, I use the word coincides, it coincides temporally with the rise of some form of Republican governance, and so it is not at all unlikely that these things are meaningfully related. It would be easy to see how, right? If you have centralized monarchical predatory regimes, it's easier for them to boss people around and make them do work on projects for which they don't necessarily benefit, like building the pyramids being a pretty extreme example of this, or even public works more generally, without feeding people, of course, providing for them while they work, because that's just essential, but not engaging in any kind of give and take into contractual relationships. And that's something we find when the dust settles, when evidence begins to kick in for those kinds of phenomena. We find a very strong tradition already in place in these Republican city-states of market relations in the economic sphere more generally, and also with respect to labor.
So if one were to kind of press you a little further and say, if you go more deeply into an analysis of the social structures that are bringing this on, what accounts for these commonalities, political systems which are kind of more consensual, labor systems which are more consensual. Is there something deeper here that's in evidence?
You could say these are just different sides of the same phenomenon, and then you have to. There's a twist.
No, I mean in terms of distinguishing the West from.
Oh, I see. Well, there's a twist to the story too, which I should mention. It is not just the labor market. You also have the opposite extreme, which is chattel slavery. And again, it may not be by coincidence that the earliest form of what we would recognize as chattel slavery again appear exactly in that place at that time. And it seems that chattel slavery is almost like a foil to the rights of people on the inside, of citizens who have entitlements and rights you wouldn't ordinarily find in other societies, but that is partly sustained by the powerful, the rich, the elites being able to fall back on people who do not belong to this expanded in-group, people who are brought in from the outside through capture in war or purchase, who can then be exploited in a very direct and much more extravagant
well, that's
fashion.
interesting. Would you kind of suggest that if you have a society that starts out with broadly distributed resources, for whatever reason, and therefore in that society you have among the people who are inside it a kind of consensual system that operates at various levels, political, economic, military, whatever, that when that society is in a position to get really exploited labor, the elites are going to jump at the chance because it's an opportunity for them to do what they can't do at all with respect to their kind of domestic underlings.
That
there
is
a
right,
possibility?
and
Is
yeah,
that-
that's been argued for quite some time. I mean, the Harvard sociologist Joanna Patterson argued we wouldn't have the concept of freedom that we find as a positive right that we find in early Greece, arguably for the first time, had it not been for slavery providing some kind of counterpoint to that. The argument being you don't quite know what it is like to be truly free unless there is someone who is truly unfree, because it polarizes relations. And what you find in other societies is just gradations of dependence and subordination, that there would be people may not be slaves, but they would be in some relationship of debt bondage or hereditary dependence or some form of subordination that would affect their lives. And what you get in Greece and in Rome for the first time, arguably, there are no real parallels anywhere else in the world that I'm aware of, is this internal polarization between people who are citizens, who are formally free, and it comes with certain rights and entitlements and protections, and people who are totally unfree. And you can move from one side to the other through manumission and enfranchisement, which is culturally contingent, but arguably this polarization is an important part of creating this kind of egalitarian ethos of the citizenry.
So Orlando Penderson, who's written on comparative slavery, is primarily known for that, does contend that other societies have had systems that he describes as slave systems. There are slaves in other places, sometimes quite numerous. I think I remember in reading his book that Korea at some point, 50% of the population is slave. But it's a different kind of slavery in that case?
Yeah, the Korean case is very tricky because the evidence is poor, and in as much as we know anything about it, it seems to have been more like serfdom, arguably in the European Middle Ages, that you have dependent labor in the countryside, but they're not organized in plantations in a more rational way.
You get some of that in the Muslim world in Iraq.
You get the famous case in southern Iraq where slaves from East Africa are used to work in the marshes, in environments where it would be difficult to find other people to put to work, just as the Greeks and Romans would put their slaves into mines, which was not a
And you have the commercialization. Slaves are sold.
Slaves are
sold. There are slave markets in the Islamic world too.
That's right.
So it's a kind of gradation of slave forms.
That is true. It would be hard to find any societies that didn't have some slaves, at least. Although slavery does fade out eventually in Europe in the Middle Ages, but it takes a very long time, and of course it's then revived in the New World. In a, almost like a Greco-Roman style system. So in a way, modern colonial slavery has more in common with what Roman landowners would do in their villas, in their estates 2,000 years ago than it had with other forms of slavery in the Islamic world.
So in American slavery, the people who are starting the system, which I guess are initially the Portuguese and the Spanish, are they self-consciously modeling the slave systems they're establishing on what they remember of Roman practice?
There seems to be a degree of continuity that goes back to the medieval Levant, to places like Lebanon and Cyprus and other islands in the Mediterranean, where some form of ancient chattel slavery seems to survive throughout this period and is then picked up by people on the Iberian Peninsula in particular, is exported to the, the Canaries, into the Atlantic, and then makes the jump into the New World eventually. So there is some structural institutional continuity in a way. Not so much awareness, I think, among at least the earlier planters of ancient
It's not their classical
models.
education.
Well, you find later on in the 19th century, in the southern states here, people who, well, may or may not have a classical education, but they are aware of the Roman agronomists, for instance, or, which is actually quite striking, which takes us back to comparative history, they face very similar problems in their way managing slave plantations, and they come up with similar solutions or similar sentiments about slaves, how to manage slaves, which are eerily reminiscent of what Roman writers used to say 2,000 years earlier. And it's not just a case of cultural transmission, it's a case of similar circumstances producing recognizably similar outcomes.
So the work that you're now doing on inequality, the Great Leveler, what is the Great Leveler?
The Great Leveler is violence. So my You will have heard of Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, where he makes the argument that the Western developed countries are not nearly as unequal as they used to be because of the massive shocks that occurred between 1914 and 45, especially the two world wars, that level in any number of ways by destroying capital, by forcing governments to take better care of their people. It's a side effect of mass mobilization and the destruction of war. It all acts together to create, at least for a while, a more egalitarian world. And I thought, well, is this true more generally of world history? And what I've found so far is that if you look at any documented societies in history, reaching back up to 5,000 years, wherever you find evidence, there don't seem to be all that many mechanisms of significant leveling, factors that can really substantially reduce inequality in terms of income and wealth that are not violent in nature. So what I've found is there are really four levelers, which I call the four horsemen of the apocalypse in this case, which would be mass mobilization warfare, which is largely, not entirely, but largely a modern 20th century phenomenon, even though it goes back to the French Revolution. You have antecedents in...
But you can find it in the city-states.
Well, exactly. You find it in the warring states in China, and most famously, of course, in Greek city-states, where, again, it seems to have had some leveling effect. Already.
In the case of China, it's that peasants get land.
Peasants get land. It's, again, the evidence is unfortunately rather murky. It seems to be a system driven not just by coercion, but by tangible rewards, and in that sense it would be more similar to more modern varieties. Then the second factor would be transformative revolution, which is very much a phenomenon of the 20th century from 1917 onwards, which levels in obvious ways and is obviously extremely violent. You have state failure, the collapse of states, that drives down inequality for the simple reason that for most of history, states used to be very predatory and run by people who are both powerful and wealthy at the same time.
Very redistributive. The redistribution
they're very
up.
aggressive
Right.
systems. They're very good at redistributing wealth from the actual producers to the original, I call them the original 1%. The original 1% are not people we are familiar with who make money by having great jobs and investing their capital. They are the 1% because they run the show, they rule with an iron fist, and they benefit materially. And if these states collapse, these elites are either diminished or entirely destroyed in extreme cases. Everybody is worse off in a way, but the rich have so much more to lose, right? If you're a subsistence farmer, there isn't all that much. You can starve to death.
So early medieval Europe was a more egalitarian Europe than the Roman Empire.
The richest people in medieval kingdoms are not nearly as rich, both in absolute terms and relative to the general population as there were in Rome or later.
Is the tiller of the soil better off in medieval times?
Arguably, at least initially in medieval times, because of the big collapse, not just of extractive institutions, but also because of the first iteration of the Black Death that sweeps in the 6th, 7th century, kills lots of people.
Is that one of your levelers?
That's level number 4, see? Level number 4 is pandemics. At least in pre-modern societies, we wouldn't arguably benefit, if you can even use the word benefit in this context, from a major epidemic. But in agrarian systems where you have Malthusian pressures, if a third of the people die off, but the infrastructure is still intact, then these assets will come to be more evenly distributed. And again, it's the ruling class that suffers disproportionately in those cases.
So, if you, well, let me see if I can just challenge that a little bit in history. If you look at the part of medieval history that's after the plague as before the plague, that while the initial effect is to create a larger class of free laborers, you also have developing, not long after, absolutism in a more drastic way. Now, maybe the big losers in absolutism are the aristocracies, so in point of fact, it does reflect a kind of leveling. But it seems a little more complicated.
I'm talking about strictly about economic inequality. Political inequality is a related issue, but it's not coextensive with economic inequality. They don't always move in the same direction at the same speed and in the same way. So I think the rise of absolutism is really linked to the rise of the fiscal state in Europe. That's very much driven by interstate competition and warfare, and that's not directly related to these demographic phenomena that mediate levels of inequality in this period.
So, if we take the opposite, we don't have a mass mobilization state, we have a state with a professional military, or a state that's so large it really doesn't have to worry, for the most part, about outside challenges on a routine basis. We have a state that is strong. It doesn't collapse. It's well organized. We have a state where plagues have not struck for a long time. What's your fourth? Leaving something.
It was Transformative Revolution,
Oh,
which
you don't
again
have a
is not
Transformative Revolution. So that state sounds to me, if you're looking at historical examples, much like China over long periods of time. Is Chinese inequality greater in the pre-modern age than European inequality?
That would be a very broad question, and the data for China are not particularly good. What we do know is that China was not particularly unequal, even on the eve of Mao's revolution, compared to how unequal Europe was right before the outbreak of World War I. The same is true of Russia, incidentally. That's partly a function
Russia was more or less.
Was moderately unequal, which may seem strange because we think of Russian society as being polarized between rich landlords who sit in St. Petersburg and drink champagne and millions of serfs toiling away in the countryside. But inasmuch as we can measure this, which is difficult to do, levels of inequality are not nearly as high as they were in industrialized countries in Western Europe or North America at the time. And it's partly a function of economic development. The richer society is, the bigger the surplus is. So simply for statistical reasons, it's easier for elites to capture more surplus because there's simply more
Does wealth here in that case mean wealth consumed or wealth controlled?
Both. So I talk about income and wealth inequality. So income would be wealth consumed and wealth would be wealth held. And again, they tend to move in similar ways, although there are, again, significant differences.
Right, because if you're talking about wealth held, and I would think that at any given time, the amount of, in an industrial society, the amount of wealth held would be considerably greater than the amount of wealth consumed. Because you're really talking about the entire industrial infrastructure of a country with, if it has private property. That while that may register in a kind of formal system of classification as inequality, it might in point of fact operate to spread wealth around to a greater degree, and as I was kind of saying this morning, to give ordinary people more of an opportunity to make choices meaningful to them than a system, say, as in the Soviet Union, where the wealth held was held in the hands of a small state apparatus.
That's true, although if you look, say, that's a famous or infamous example at Britain, in 1913, let's say, right before World War I, the richest 10% of the population held 90% of all wealth, and the richest 1% had 70% of total national wealth. There isn't that much left in the system for people who are not part of the elite. So even though in theory they have access to opportunity, de facto, it didn't really happen.
Well, but it depends what they're doing with their wealth. If they're investing in factories,
yeah.
or if they're going on fox hunts, you know, different outcomes there.
That's true. Well, yes, and we do both.
Particularly for a fox.
Yeah.
You know. So, so that's your thesis.
That's the thesis.
And how far along are you now? When can we expect to see
it's 90% finished. I hope to finish it in March, and it should come out early in 2017. It's going to be published by Princeton, which is nice. So we'll see.
So the institute we run here in a very small scale is an effort to kind of focus attention, scholarly attention, on big questions and help to encourage people to develop the conceptual apparatus that we need to kind of pursue these things fruitfully. If one had a lot of resources and one was kind of organizing a project on a very grand scale, you know, in academic terms, what would you try to do if this were your project?
If it was my project and I'd have unlimited resources, I would initiate a collaborative effort on revisiting the question of why is the world the way it is? How did modernity arise? Why did it arise at a certain time in a certain place? And bring together, and I think that hasn't really been done much or at all, again, people from different disciplines, because there is a body of literature in economics, a body of literature in political science, a body of literature in history. And all these types of research are pursued, not in isolation, that's not true, but there isn't nearly as much interaction as there should be. So what I would do is create a genuinely transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary team of people charged with addressing this question, also coming up with better ways of studying it.
Would this require, to a large extent, training young people in a different way in order to produce a collegial body of folks who could do this work?
I believe so, and I think that's one of the big weaknesses of academia today, especially in the humanities, in my own field, history, that there's simply incentive structure set up in a way that discourages that kind of formal collaboration from very early on.
Well, what sort of training would you recommend for a program that had the resources to kind of break the mold?
It's difficult not to avoid the question. It's difficult to break the mold because you can train people any way you like, but then they have to find jobs. And that's what I meant when I talked about the incentive structure. Of course, you can set up a program where you just teach and train across standard disciplinary boundaries. You can give it a special name. It can be the interdisciplinary degree in something or other. But then at the end of the day, unless you employ people for life once they have trained them, they have to go out and find jobs that will inevitably be located.
Well, say it's a burgeoning movement, and you are the prime architect. They're looking to you for intellectual and academic guidance. What kind of regimen of preparation would you recommend?
It would be a mix of formal social science training, getting people to familiarize themselves with all the techniques out there, statistics, and so on. Focus on hypothesis testing, the idea that whatever you do has to be driven by trying to address bigger questions and by being very clear about, again, about causation, about how to go about analyzing developments with an eye to causation, but at the same time not getting all caught up only in multivariate regression analysis and research design, but having a grasp of history more broadly in this case, maybe branching out into literature, art, whatever is relevant for the question that you are pursuing.
Well, when I have my $100 million, you have the job.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you very much for joining us today.